You've likely heard the number before, but you probably dismissed it because it sounds like a mathematical error or a grim exaggeration. For nearly 99% of human history, your odds of surviving until your 13th birthday were exactly 50-50, half. Half of every person who was ever born, every child who took their first breath in a cave or a thatched hut, was gone before they could even think about having children of their own. If you applied those numbers to any other large mammal, you would be looking at a species on the fast track to extinction. And yet, here you are, sitting in a climate-controlled room with a medicine cabinet full of synthesized miracles, looking back at a lineage that somehow defied the most brutal lottery in the history of biology. You probably woke up today with a slightly stuffy nose or a dull headache and reached for a bottle of ibuprofen without even looking at the label. It is a mundane, almost thoughtless ritual. We view ourselves as these fragile, soft-bodied creatures who would fall apart the second the pharmacy doors locked. We look at the past and see a graveyard of people who didn't know what a germ was, assuming they were just helpless victims of a cruel environment. But that perspective is actually a bit of an insult to your ancestors. They weren't just lucky. They were the most sophisticated medical engineers on the planet long before they had a word for medicine. But don't mistake that ingenuity for some kind of mystical ancient wisdom or a magical connection to the earth. It wasn't about being in tune with the universe. It was about being observant enough to notice when a chimpanzee was eating something that should have killed it. In 1987, a researcher named Michael Huffman was watching a chimpanzee in Tanzania. This chimp, part of the Mahale K group, was clearly miserable. She was lethargic, her coat was dull, and she was suffering from a massive parasite load that would have eventually ended her life. Huffman watched as she did something bizarre. She sought out a plant called Vernonia amygdalina. Now, chimps usually avoid this plant because the pith inside the stems is incredibly bitter and, in large doses, quite toxic. But this chimp wasn't eating it for food. She was carefully peeling back the bark and sucking on the juices of the pith. Within 24 hours, her strength returned and her parasite count plummeted. This was the birth of a field we now call zoopharmacognosy, the study of how animals self-medicate. Early humans weren't living in a vacuum. They were the world's greatest mimics. They watched what the goats ate when they had stomach aches. They noticed which roots the bears dug up after a long winter of hibernation. We didn't invent the idea that plants could be tools. We stole the blueprint from the creatures around us. Imagine an ancient parent watching a sick child and remembering that the deer always chewed on a specific type of root when they looked sluggish. That is not just survival. That is the beginning of a data-gathering process that has lasted for 300,000 years. Every time you drink a cup of ginger tea for a settled stomach, you are essentially practicing an animal behavior that predates the human brain itself. This observation wasn't a one-time event, but a multi-generational experiment. Huffman's research showed that these behaviors are socially transmitted. Young chimps watch their mothers and learn which plants are food and which are medicine. Humans took this to the next level. We didn't just watch the chimps, we watched the birds, the insects, and the predators. We became the ultimate apprentices of the natural world, turning the entire planet into a giant, living laboratory where the price of a failed experiment was death. You might think this process of trial and error was a slow, gentle evolution of knowledge, but the reality was often much more immediate and much more violent. Sometimes, the medicine didn't come from a plant at all. It was written directly into our DNA through a process that is as fascinating as it is terrifying. Think about malaria. It has killed more humans than every war in history combined. If you lived in sub-Saharan Africa or Southeast Asia 10,000 years ago, a mosquito bite wasn't a nuisance. It was a potential end-of-life event. But then a glitch appeared in the human genome. It is called the sickle cell trait. If you inherit this glitch from both parents, you get a debilitating blood disease. But if you only get it from one, your red blood cells change shape just enough that the malaria parasite cannot take hold. It is a brutal trade-off. Evolution essentially said, I will give some of you a blood disorder if it means the rest of you don't die of a fever. We see this again with something called the Duffy null allele. In parts of Africa, nearly 99% of the population has this specific genetic marker that makes it impossible for the most common malaria parasite to enter their red blood cells. We didn't survive sickness just by being smart. We survived it by being edited. Your body is a walking record of every plague your ancestors managed to outlast. You are the product of a biological arms race where the medicine was a mutation that happened to work. When you think about it that way, your very existence is a medical miracle that happened long before the first hospital was built. It is a bit unsettling to realize that our survival often depended on a lucky mistake in our genetic code, a typo that turned out to be a shield. This genetic editing goes even deeper. Consider the CCR5 delta 32 mutation. Researchers believe this specific genetic tweak, found in about 10% of Europeans, originally provided resistance to the bubonic plague or smallpox. Today, it famously provides some individuals with natural resistance to HIV. We didn't choose these medicines. They were forged in the fires of massive die-offs. For every person today who carries one of these protective genes, there were thousands of ancestors who didn't, and who paid the ultimate price. Your DNA is not just a blueprint. It is a survivor's journal, written in the blood of those who didn't make it. While these genetic shields worked in the background, our ancestors were also developing physical interventions that feel shockingly modern, even if they looked like something out of a horror movie. For a long time, historians believed that complex surgery was a byproduct of the agricultural revolution, that you needed cities and stored food to have the leisure time to learn how to cut into a human body. Then, in 2022, a discovery in a cave called Liang Tebo in Borneo flipped that entire narrative upside down. Archaeologists found the skeleton of a young person who lived 31,000 years ago. This wasn't just any skeleton. This individual had their lower left leg surgically amputated as a child. And here is the wow factor. The bone showed clear signs of healing that continued for 6 to 9 years after the procedure. This means that 30 millennia ago, a group of hunter-gatherers had the anatomical knowledge to navigate veins, arteries, and nerves without the patient bleeding out. They had the antiseptic knowledge to keep a massive open wound from turning gangrenous in a tropical rainforest, one of the most bacteria-rich environments on Earth. And they had the social structure to carry, feed, and protect a person with limited mobility for nearly a decade. We used to think the first amputations happened maybe 7,000 years ago with the advent of farming. This one find pushed that date back by 24,000 years. It suggests that medicine wasn't just a side hobby for ancient humans. It was a core survival skill. They were performing successful high-stakes surgery with stone tools and plant-based anesthetics. When you complain about the wait time at an urgent care clinic, remember that 30,000 years ago, your ancestors were performing vascular surgery in the dark, and they were getting it right. They likely used mosses and barks with natural antibiotic properties, some of which we are only now rediscovering in our frantic search for alternatives to failing modern antibiotics. They understood that the body could be repaired, that a limb lost didn't have to mean a life lost. This implies a level of care and medical specialization that we previously thought was impossible for primitive people. They weren't just surviving. They were practicing medicine with a precision that should make us stop and rethink everything we know about the Stone Age. However, not every medical breakthrough was as dramatic as a stone tool amputation. Some of the most powerful medicine was actually being produced by the human body itself, hidden in plain sight. Think about the last time you saw a mother nursing a baby. It looks like a simple act of nutrition, but modern science has revealed it is actually the most complex pharmacy on the planet. Researcher Katie Himdy has spent years studying the biological signals in breast milk, and what she found is staggering. When a baby suckles, a vacuum is created, and a small amount of the baby's saliva is actually sucked back into the mother's nipple. The mother's body then scans that saliva for pathogens. If the baby is fighting a cold or an infection, the mother's body detects the distress signal and immediately begins producing specific antibodies tailored to that exact illness. By the next feeding, the milk's composition has changed to deliver the precise medicine the baby needs. Furthermore, human milk contains complex sugars called human milk oligosaccharides, or HMOs. The baby cannot even digest these sugars. They pass right through the stomach. Why are they there? To feed a very specific type of good bacteria in the gut, specifically Bifidobacterium infantis, which acts as a primary defense against infection. Ancient humans didn't need to know the chemistry of HMOs to know that breastfeeding was the difference between a child living or dying. They were utilizing a real-time biofeedback medical manufacturing system that we still cannot fully replicate in a lab today. This is the quiet, invisible medicine that kept our species from blinking out during the thousands of years when we were most vulnerable. Imagine the sheer volume of biological data being processed by a nursing mother's body. It is a diagnostic and manufacturing suite more advanced than anything in a modern hospital. This wasn't just food. It was a personalized, daily vaccine and antibiotic treatment designed by millions of years of mammalian evolution. This process ensured that even before a child had an immune system of its own, it was being shielded by the accumulated experience of its mother's immune system. It is perhaps the most elegant medical solution ever devised, and we've been using it for as long as we've been human. Despite these biological advantages, there were times when the sickness was too big for a single body to handle, and that's when our ancestors turned to a strategy we all became very familiar with recently: social engineering. We like to think that social distancing was a 2020 invention, but it is actually one of the oldest medical interventions in our repertoire. If you look at nomadic groups or even our primate cousins, you see a very specific disgust reflex. This isn't just about being squeamish, it's a survival mechanism. Evolutionary psychologists call it the behavioral immune system. Ancient humans lived in small, tight-knit bands, which is the perfect environment for a virus to wipe everyone out. To counter this, they developed rituals that we often label as taboos or superstitions, but which were actually public health mandates. For example, many cultures have ancient rules about handling the dead or which animals are unclean to eat. We now know that these rules often tracked perfectly with the risk of zoonotic diseases or parasites. When a group moved their camp because of a bad spirit in the water, they were often just responding to the reality of a contaminated well. They were practicing epidemiology without the charts. They noticed that when one person started coughing in a specific way, the ones who slept closest to them were the next to get sick. So they created space. They isolated the sick, not out of cruelty, but as a recognized form of protection for the group. We see this in modern-day foragers. Their social structures are built around minimizing the spread of infection through high-frequency movement and specific hygiene rituals. It is a reminder that our most effective medicine wasn't always a pill or a surgery. Sometimes it was just the collective intelligence to stay apart when the spirits were angry. This behavioral immune system is so powerful that it actually shapes our personalities and our cultures. Research suggests that in areas of the world with historically high parasite loads, cultures tend to be more conservative and wary of outsiders, a social defense mechanism designed to prevent the introduction of new alien diseases. We didn't just survive sickness with herbs. We survived it by building our entire social world around the threat of infection. Our traditions, our fears, and even our manners are often just ancient public health protocols that have been polished into cultural norms over thousands of years. It's easy to look back and see these behaviors as primitive guesses, but they were actually the foundation of a massive shared library of human resilience. The real secret to how we survived wasn't any one plant or any one surgery. It was the fact that we were the only species that could pass this information down through stories. Imagine the value of an elder who lived through a specific plague 30 years prior. She wasn't just a family member. She was a living database. She remembered which berry stopped the diarrhea and which leaf made the heart race. In a world without books, the elderly were the medical journals. This is why humans are one of the few species where females live long past their reproductive years, the grandmother hypothesis. Their value wasn't in having more babies, but in keeping the current ones alive with their accumulated medical knowledge. When a healer or an elder died, it was the equivalent of a library burning down. This shared memory is what allowed us to inhabit every corner of the globe. When humans moved into the Arctic, they had to learn a whole new set of medical challenges compared to the savanna. They didn't have time to wait for evolution to catch up. They had to learn, record, and teach. That is the true definition of medicine: the refusal to let the same mistake happen twice. We are the descendants of the people who listened to the stories. This oral tradition created a collective brain that could hold more information than any single individual. One person might know how to set a bone, while another knew the exact time of year to harvest a specific bark for the best medicinal potency. By networking this knowledge, ancient groups created a robust medical system that was constantly being updated. We see evidence of this in the archaeological record, where medical kits containing various herbs and tools have been found in the remains of people who traveled hundreds of miles. They weren't just wandering. They were carrying a mobile pharmacy, a concentrated version of their tribe's collective wisdom. This brings us to the most remarkable part of the story: the transition from magic to science. For much of our history, there was no distinction between the two. If a specific root cured a fever, it was because the root had a spirit that fought the spirit of the fever. We might laugh at that now, but the result was the same. The spirit was just a placeholder for an active chemical compound we hadn't named yet. Think about the plant Artemisia annua, or sweet wormwood. It has been used in traditional Chinese medicine for over 2,000 years to treat intermittent fevers. Ancient healers didn't know about the Plasmodium parasite, but they knew the tea worked. Fast forward to the 1970s, and a researcher named Tu Youyou began scouring ancient texts for a way to treat drug-resistant malaria. She found a reference to wormwood in a 1,600-year-old manual called Emergency Prescriptions Kept Up One's Sleeve. By following the ancient instructions, which specifically said to soak the leaves in cold water rather than boiling them, she was able to isolate artemisinin, which is now the gold standard for malaria treatment worldwide. She won the Nobel Prize for it in 2015. This isn't just an anecdote. It is proof that ancient medicine wasn't fake just because the explanations were mythological. It was real chemistry, discovered through thousands of years of human observation. We are only now beginning to realize how much of that ancient library we have lost, and how much we desperately need to find again as our modern drugs begin to fail. There are likely thousands of other emergency prescriptions hidden in the traditions of indigenous groups and ancient texts, waiting for us to stop being arrogant enough to ignore them. We are currently in a race against time to document this knowledge before the last generations of traditional healers pass away, taking their living libraries with them. But let's go back to that scratchy throat you felt this morning. When you reach for that aspirin, you are actually engaging in a conversation with the past. Aspirin is a synthetic version of salicin, a compound found in willow bark. Humans have been chewing on willow bark for at least 3,500 years. It is mentioned in the Ebers Papyrus from ancient Egypt as a remedy for pain. You aren't just taking a modern pill. You are taking a refined version of an ancient Egyptian remedy. The advanced world we live in is built on a foundation of primitive discoveries. We like to think of the history of medicine as a straight line moving from ignorance to enlightenment, but it is more like a massive, tangled web. Every time we discover a new drug, there is a good chance we are just finally understanding why a specific leaf worked for a Neanderthal 50,000 years ago. We are the inheritors of a vast global experiment that has never stopped running. Our ancestors were the ones who did the hard work of dying so that we could know what was safe to eat. They were the ones who figured out how to survive in the most hostile environments on Earth without a single antibiotic. They were the ones who looked at a sick child and refused to give up, inventing surgery and pharmacology on the fly with nothing but stone and plants. We also have to acknowledge the dark side of this survival. The filter of ancient sickness was incredibly cruel. The 50% who didn't survive were often the most vulnerable. This wasn't a survival of the fittest in some heroic sense. It was often just a survival of the luckiest. For every person who was cured by a shaman, there were others for whom the medicine came too late, or for whom the cure was just as dangerous as the disease. Ancient medicine was a high-stakes gamble. Trepanation, the practice of drilling a hole in the skull to relieve pressure or release spirits, had a surprisingly high survival rate, with some studies suggesting up to 90% bone regrowth. But the 10% who didn't survive died in unimaginable pain. The history of medicine is not just a story of triumph. It is a story of desperation. It is the story of a species that was so afraid of death that it was willing to try anything, no matter how terrifying, to stay alive for one more day. That desperation is what drove the innovation that eventually became modern science. We didn't become smart and then start practicing medicine. We started practicing medicine because we were scared, and that practice is what eventually made us smart. The realization that our ancestors were this capable changes the way you look at the world. It makes the primitive past seem much closer and much more relatable. They weren't different from us. They were just us, but without the safety net. They had the same brains, the same fears, and the same drive to protect their families. When you see a mother in a museum's archaeological display buried with her child 6,000 years ago, you aren't looking at a specimen. You are looking at a person who likely tried every herb, every prayer, and every ritual she knew to keep that child alive. We are the ones whose ancestors succeeded. We are the winners of a very long, very painful game. And that brings us back to that unsettling number we started with, the 50%. If you had been born at any other time in the last 300,000 years, there is a 1 in 2 chance you wouldn't be here to listen to this. The fact that you are here is not a guarantee of your biology. It is a testament to the thousands of generations of people who were observant enough, desperate enough, and brave enough to experiment on themselves. They turned the world's poisons into its cures. They turned their own bodies into shields and their stories into libraries. We didn't beat nature, we just learned how to read its manual. And as we face new challenges, new viruses, drug-resistant bacteria, and a changing climate, we might find that the answers aren't in our futuristic labs, but in the memories of the people who survived long before labs existed. We are part of a continuous line of healers and survivors that stretches back to the very first human who noticed that a certain leaf made the pain go away. It is a strange thing to realize that your very existence is a statistical anomaly. You are the end product of a 50,000-year survival marathon where the losers were forgotten and the winners were the ones who were just lucky enough to chew on the right piece of bark or have the right glitch in their blood. We like to think of ourselves as the masters of our environment, the people who finally conquered disease with our white coats and sterile labs. But the truth is much more humbling than that. We aren't the ones who beat the odds. We are just the ones who are still standing while the odds continue to play out. You are not a separate entity from the ancient human shivering in a cave. You are the same biological machine, still running on the same desperate improvised code. Half of us were always meant to die so that the other half could learn how to live.